It wasn't supposed to be like this. The war in Ukraine was supposed to be a cakewalk for Russia, a nuclear-armed great power, as they swept into their smaller neighbor and just subjugated them. In fact, as the war began in 2022, Putin was making bold claims of conquering Ukraine within weeks, and then turning his sights on the nations on Ukraine's border. Instead, over a year later, the vast majority of Ukrainian territory is still in Ukraine's hands. Life in Kyiv goes on, with the primary threat being occasional aerial bombardment from Russia. Most of the combat is confined to the eastern swath of Ukraine that Putin quickly conquered in the early days of the war, and even that is hotly contested by dogged Ukrainian defenders. NATO weapons continue to flow into the resilient Eastern European nation, and Ukraine has even made noises toward making a fight for the Crimean Peninsula, which Russia annexed back in 2014. So, how did it all go so horribly wrong for Russia, and how did Putin initially see the war ending? At the beginning of the war, it wasn't just Putin who thought the war would be quick and end badly for Ukraine. Most of Ukraine's allies did as well. In the opening days, Putin was making outlandish nuclear threats, and most of Ukraine's supporters were issuing condemnations, but quietly trying to convince President Zelensky to evacuate with his family and fight on in exile. But Zelensky knew that this was far from a guarantee of safety, given how many of Putin's enemies have wound up drinking polonium cocktails, so he and Ukraine fought on. And it would largely all come down to one key battle. Today, Putin talks about liberating Russian-speaking areas of Ukraine and has even annexed some of them in sham referendums. But that wasn't his target in the opening days. That was the heart of Ukraine. Putin was making the claim that Ukraine needed to be denazified, considered by most to be a ridiculous claim given that Ukraine's current president is Jewish. And to do that, he intended to strike at Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine. He assumed, and was probably right, that if Ukraine's capital was conquered and its government was toppled, there would be no organized resistance and the world would eventually grudgingly accept the conquest in the same way the world accepted China's takeover of Tibet. But Ukraine proved to have something to say about that. In the early days of the war, support for Ukraine was still tentative. Between Putin's threats and doubts over whether Ukraine had a chance of fighting back, governments hadn't committed heavy military aid yet. Ukraine was largely on its own as people waited to see if the government and the army would hold out long enough for them to step in and make the difference. And the threat was coming fast, but not from Russia's border. Kyiv is far from Russia, but is far closer to another border, that of Belarus, a former Soviet Socialist republic ruled by the infamous dictator Alexander Lukashenko, and Putin had a chip to call in. Lukashenko is largely Putin's only ally left in Europe, but their relationship isn't equal. Lukashenko was nearly toppled several years back by populist uprisings following another rigged election that kept him in power, and Putin offered him support and supplies. The result was Lukashenko clinging onto power, but it's now heavily in debt to Putin. While Belarus has not committed troops to Ukraine and is believed to not pose much of a threat if it did, its geographic advantage was more than enough for Putin, because the troops were about to pour in from the north. Only days after the war began, Russian forces began attacking near Kyiv, first trying to take the airport in the city of Hostomel. The Russian forces had surprise and firepower on their side and overtook the airport in less than a day. Soon, Kyiv was under attack from a combination of Russian saboteurs, ground gunfire, and air attack. By the next morning, heavy aerial bombardment of the city had begun, and no one was sure how long Kyiv could hold out. The Ukrainian defenders were fighting back fiercely, but they were heavily outgunned. But then the tide started turning. It was clear Russia's plan was to choke off Kyiv, and a key part of that was cutting off the power. An attack on a nearby power plant could have plunged much of the city into darkness, but the attack on the Troyeshina neighborhood instead saw the Russian forces running. While Ukrainian forces took heavy losses, they were defending the city center, keeping Russian agents from approaching within 19 miles of the heart of the city. That kept the government and much of the civilian population safe, and Zelensky was going to keep it that way. Several key policy decisions made the difference in keeping Kyiv from falling, the first of which was the government's decision to impose a curfew on the city during the nighttime. That made it much harder for Russians to infiltrate the city by impersonating civilians. Anyone out during the night was deemed a saboteur, and they could face deadly force. That meant any Russian sabotage would have to happen during the daytime, when it could be more easily detected and repelled, and the defense of the city would be heavily organized by one man. Ukraine seems to have a thing for celebrity politicians who surprise the world. Zelensky got his start as an actor who played the president on an acclaimed comedy. And Kyiv's mayor is currently the world-famous boxer Vitaly Klitschko, who helped to organize the people to combat the Russian attack and oversaw the curfew. While Klitschko was condemned for accidentally releasing false information that the city was encircled, he's been praised as one of the faces of the Ukrainian resistance. Now it was clear that Kyiv could fight back, things were only going to intensify. When a Russian convoy tried to set up a base in Kyiv, they met fierce opposition from locals and were routed. In the opening days of the battle, civilians were using Molotov cocktails and other improvised weapons to fend off the Russians, but that was only until weapons could be distributed. The Ukrainian military acted quickly to distribute over 18,000 guns during the first day of the battle, and Ukraine activated its territorial defense forces from the reserves. Combined with the civilian forces, Ukraine was looking like it could turn the tide, and that meant Russia was about to step things up. Over the next month, Russia would continue to bombard Kyiv and send in large convoys of troops and weapons. But by this point, military aid was flowing in, and Kyiv had the reinforcements it needed. As Russian troops tried to knock out Kyiv's infrastructure, Russia saw itself take massive losses. Multiple attempts to encircle Kyiv failed, and Ukraine was able to maintain corridors in and out of the city that allowed aid to come in and civilians to flee. Russia, meanwhile, saw its momentum stall as Ukraine began to retake territory. By March 22nd, Ukraine would launch its own counteroffensive, and soon they would pull off one of the most impressive military moves in recent memory. The Russians were aiming to make their way into Kyiv via the Irpin River and had built themselves a series of pontoon bridges to make it easier to cross. While Ukraine heavily targeted the bridges, there was still one remaining. If the Russians got across, it could allow for them to gather their forces and overwhelm the city, which meant it was time to go big. Ukraine made the risky decision to blow the dam at the Kyiv reservoir, taking out a key part of their own infrastructure and causing a flood that swelled the river, taking out the final pontoon bridge without ever firing a shot. The Russians fled the surge of water and found themselves stranded in a swamp where they were vulnerable to Ukrainian counterattacks. It was the latest devastating blow to the Russians in a humiliating phased offensive. And slowly but surely, Kyiv was starting to feel safe again. On March 29th, Russia announced it was pulling out of Kyiv while conceding nothing and not promising a cessation of attacks. This led to key moves such as the EU Parliament president visiting Kyiv, the first EU official to visit since the war began. But even more important to many shell-shocked residents of the city, Klitschko removed the temporary ban on liquor sales so everyone could celebrate their victory. But there would be no celebration in Moscow. While Russia had been humiliated in Kyiv, the country was still looking like the heavy favorite in the war. After all, they had conquered a large swath of Ukraine in the east and were taking control of the Black Sea. They were seeking to intimidate the rest of the world out of getting involved. But the problem was, Russia wasn't looking all that intimidating anymore. For the first time in the war, the mighty Russian bear looked beatable, and that would change the battlefield in other ways. For the first time, people were considering the chance of a Ukrainian victory, and Putin wanted to stomp that out as quickly as he could. If he couldn't win fast, he would win slow, by grinding Ukraine and its allies down to nothing. A combination of a brutal offensive taking towns piece by piece and ruthless aerial bombardments of cities including Kyiv would slowly break the spirit of the Ukrainian fighters, and eventually supplies would dry up. There was just one wild card: the potential intervention of NATO and other allies of Ukraine. And Putin wanted the whole world to see that he wouldn't be beaten easily. At the same time as the Battle of Kyiv was turning into a shocking Ukrainian victory, another battle was unfolding far away, with a very different outcome. The coastal city of Mariupol was not a major city, but it was a key strategic location, and Putin was quickly overwhelming it. The siege of Mariupol began days before the attack on Kyiv and continued almost for 2 months. Unlike Kyiv, it was not a strategic game of subterfuge. It was a slow, grinding, brutal affair that provided a preview to how Putin would attempt to win the war in the long stretch. And it came with a horrific human cost. In addition to a heavy troop presence, Russia hit Mariupol with aerial bombardments for weeks at a time, leading to most of the citizens evacuating the bombed-out city. What remained was little more than a husk occupied by dogged Ukrainian defenders waging a guerrilla war against the Russian occupiers. But even they couldn't hold out forever. On May 25th, the last defenders surrendered, and Russia formally took control of the city, or at least what was left of it. It was the most significant Russian military victory of the war, but it also left them with little more than a strategic outpost and a moral victory, because Mariupol was essentially gone. Was this a sign of things to come? Putin's plan for a slow, grinding win to the war hinged on a few key factors. For one thing, he assumed that there was a point where Ukraine's suffering would grow so great they would be willing to come to the negotiating table and give him what he wanted, which was probably everything. The other element was that he assumed the supply of aid and weapons from NATO would dry up eventually due to a lack of success and a heavy drain on the government's budget, as well as some good old-fashioned intimidation. And he had several cards to play. So how did Putin intend to break the spirit of the West? The tactic he used from the start was threats, and lots of them. Putin controls the largest nuclear arsenal in the world, although no one knows just how much of that Cold War-era arsenal is functional anymore. But the odds are that a few of those missiles could hit their target, and that fear might have been enough to scare some people off of getting directly involved. Putin doesn't acknowledge Ukraine as an independent nation and has repeatedly cast the war as an internal matter and implied that any attempt to take back areas annexed by Russia would be attacking Russia. But the threats only go so far. It's a hard lesson many parents learn when raising unruly kids. Threats only work as many times as it takes for them to figure out you're not going to follow through. Of course, the stakes are much higher here, but Putin's early threats of nuclear war and attacking NATO turned out to be a lot of hot air. NATO didn't attack Russian planes, despite early calls for a no-fly zone, and NATO troops were not on the ground in the battle for Ukraine. So anyone could see that an attack by Putin would be the one that escalates the situation and would bring the whole alliance down on Putin's already weakened arsenal. But that doesn't mean he didn't have other weapons in his playbook. The war didn't end in spring or summer as Putin had hoped, but that led to his next strategy. Because winter was coming and everyone knows Russian winters are brutal. Not only did Putin hope this would slow down the Ukrainian pushback, but it gave him a new way to turn the screws on Europe. Despite the heavy economic sanctions on Russia, there was one area that wasn't fully cut off: oil and natural gas. That's because much of Europe relies on Russia as their primary supplier of heating supplies. While turning off the pipelines might have hurt Russia's economy even further, it would have had far more devastating impacts on Europe, forcing partial shutdowns to conserve energy at best and killing thousands in a cold snap at worst. But it turns out Ukraine might have another ally: Mother Nature. While there were some cold periods, Europe turned out to have a surprisingly warm winter. This didn't mean they didn't need gas, but it did mean the demand was low enough that they had time to amass additional supplies from other places around the world. Not only did this mean Russia couldn't effectively blackmail Europe to stop aiding Ukraine, but it potentially meant that Europe would develop new connections that would allow it to wean itself off of Russian gas and oil entirely, leaving a key pillar in Russia's economy in shambles, which led to Russia asking itself, what's the exit strategy? While the first month of the war brought good news to Russia with one fast military victory after another, it's been all downhill from there. Not only have they largely been held to the gains they had in the opening days of the war, but Ukraine has taken back many key locations and forces Russia to fight for every inch. Any town Russia takes, like the mining town of Soledar, is largely destroyed by the end of the fighting. While Russia's been trying to recapture the eastern city of Bakhmut for months, getting dangerously close to encircling it, Ukraine continues to hold out as of mid-April 2023. And that leaves Putin with another major problem. Both Russia and Ukraine need soldiers to keep fighting, and neither one can rely on outside fighters. While Ukraine has extensive support from much of the world in the form of aid and weapons, no one's going to risk declaring war on Putin by sending troops, and Putin has few allies left. Not even Belarus is willing to send troops. This is mostly because Russian troops in Ukraine are little more than cannon fodder, and the barracks are getting awfully empty. Putin has already had to resort to a largely reviled draft, which drew heavily from ethnic minority regions of the country and sent countless troops into combat with outdated supplies. And a second go could risk a full uprising against Putin. So is the war destined to end in defeat for Putin? It seems likely, as he's losing in every way that counts. He's increasingly isolated from the world, is running low on troops and weapons, and has been unable to get any momentum going in taking more territory. Many leaders would have cut their losses, but those leaders aren't Vladimir Putin. Putin no doubt feels that if he takes this massive loss, he'll be seen as past his prime and incredibly vulnerable to a coup from within, either from a moderating force or from a hardliner who would want to take on NATO directly. Putin wants to cast himself as the indispensable man, and that means he has no effective way out. So he's hoping to get by with a little help from his friends. Putin's latest and possibly last hope in how the war in Ukraine will end is to make it a global affair. From the start, most people have thought the war was a very straightforward moral affair. After all, it's a former superpower picking a fight with a smaller country with no nuclear weapons in a revival of the Cold War dynamic of the mostly democratic Western Europe and the dictator-driven Eastern Europe. America and NATO certainly view it that way, but Putin's trying to flip the script, and he has a few audiences in mind. The few allies Putin has left are largely fellow outlaw nations, in addition to Russian puppet state Belarus and war-torn Syria, where Putin's largely kept its leader in power. The few countries supporting Russia include Iran, North Korea, and Venezuela, all of which are staunch opponents of the United States and more than willing to complicate affairs for their nemesis. Both Iran and North Korea are no doubt happy to have a new client for their sanctioned weapons programs, but none of them are strong enough to turn the tide of the war. The same can't be said for a more reluctant ally. In the early days of the war, Xi Jinping's China was one of the few countries to express support for Russia's invasion, even going so far as to announce a new partnership. Both countries are staunchly opposed to a US-run world order, and both stand to benefit from a new age of conquest, where more powerful countries can simply take what they want. And Xi, of course, has one target in mind: the disputed island nation of Taiwan, which China considers a rogue province. Taiwan is also home to the world's largest collection of semiconductor facilities and plays an incredibly key role in the world's technology sector, so conquering it would give China a huge edge in a larger war. So why isn't China offering more aid to Russia? While China's early statements were highly supportive, they've since cooled off, calling for peace talks. While the rumored terms of the peace talks were highly mocked by those in the West, it still points to them trying to play the middle. And while they've provided Russia with sanctions relief and supplies for combat, they haven't provided them with one thing on Putin's wish list: lethal aid. Russia's been receiving no weapons from China, and the fear of secondary sanctions being imposed on China's economy might be a big reason why. But there is another reason why, and it might be more important. Currently, Russia looks like a loser, with no major military victories to its name in a long time and the country under an iron boot of sanctions. The odds of a Russian victory don't look strong enough for Xi Jinping to want to risk China's place in the global economy in order to boost his military ambitions. It's also not clear if a Russian victory would actually make it easier for China to invade Taiwan, as the US might be more motivated to protect the country before anything can happen rather than try to provide aid after the fact. And it's unlikely that any other potential allies would be able to help either. Putin's been struggling to get traction in military affairs, but he has some success in another area: a charm offensive. Putin's been casting himself as the champion of the oppressed global South, which has largely been mocked by those in the West as cheap propaganda. But as long as the US remains the world's dominant superpower, there will be those who see anything opposing its power as automatically the underdog. Putin's gotten words of support from the new leader of Brazil, President Lula, who's blamed Ukraine and NATO for helping to provoke the conflict. While South Africa hasn't actively defended Putin, the current leadership has said they won't help to enforce rulings from the International Criminal Court against him, which will at least give Putin a few more possible vacation spots, which leaves Putin a man in search of an endgame. Putin's best shot for a victory in Ukraine came at the very beginning of the war, when he tried to overrun Kyiv, and that very public failure made it seem like opposing the war in Ukraine was a risk worth taking. Since then, it's all been downhill, and he's facing headwinds as he fights for every last scrap of territory. He simply doesn't have the resources to oppose a NATO-backed Ukraine, and he also doesn't have the manpower to hold out against an increasingly motivated Ukrainian military. As long as Ukraine has willing suppliers, Putin's choices are to retreat or lose slowly. That is, as long as they have suppliers. Putin's main hope for victory right now lies in political change, as a wave of authoritarian right-wing leaders and popular far-left leaders all jockey for power in countries currently led by center-left and center-right leaders. There have already been a few changes in leadership that have worked in Putin's favor, such as in Israel. While Israel is always very cautious in aiding Ukraine due to Russia's presence in Syria on its border, the previous government was seen as a more pro-Ukraine compared to the current right-wing Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And even NATO might not be immune to a dramatic shift. The UK seems to be pretty firmly locked down as pro-Ukraine now that controversial contrarian Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn has been ousted. However, the same can't be said for France. Current President Emmanuel Macron is firmly supportive of Ukraine, but his administration is besieged by street protests, and both the primary opponents, arch-right radical Marine Le Pen and the hardline socialist Jean-Luc Mélenchon, have spoken of disengaging from NATO and Ukraine. As the European Union's only nuclear power, France leaving the pro-Ukraine bloc would be a major blow. Of course, one player would have more influence than any other. Ukraine has had no more loyal ally than the United States, with President Joe Biden providing a near-endless supply of aid, supplies, and weapons, including high-level tanks and state-of-the-art missile defense systems. As the leader of the Democratic Party, Biden has kept them firmly in line, with the vast majority of the party backing aid as well as sanctions on Russia. The same can't be said for the Republicans, who are much more firmly divided. While many party members view opposing Russia as a national security issue, Putin also has supporters like renegade Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, who frequently uses Twitter to bemoan how much money is going to Ukraine. But one potential supporter might have more influence than any other. The war in Ukraine launched in 2022, but Putin's been on the outs with the United States for a long time, save for 4 years. When Donald Trump was in office, he and Putin were just short of besties. And even today, the always controversial Trump has mostly good things to say about his buddy Vlad. He's also complained about the U.S. getting involved in foreign wars and vowed to cut back on aid for Ukraine if he's elected to a second term in 2024. And while he's currently under indictment and facing various other legal issues, it hasn't dented his popularity with the party much, as he's still considered the favorite for the GOP nomination. Which means that Putin's current strategy for victory might hinge on waiting this administration out and hoping his old friend gets back in. Does the U.S. have a secret weakness of its own? Check out the U.S. military's struggle to recruit new soldiers, or watch this video instead.